There's a city underneath Calcutta that no one talks about. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. A physical city. Streets, drainage channels, market foundations. The architectural skeleton of one of the wealthiest trading ports in human history. Buried deliberately under 30 feet of colonial-era landfill, beginning in 1817, and still down there right now. I found out about it the way you find out about things that were meant to stay buried. I was looking for something else. I was tracing the engineering records of the Maratha ditch, a defensive trench the British East India Company ordered dug around Calcutta in 1742, supposedly to protect against Maratha raids. The ditch is the reason Calcutta grew the way it did. It drew the city's boundary. Everything inside it became British Calcutta. Everything outside it remained something older. But the further I went into the company records, the more I realized the ditch wasn't the real story. The raising was. Because the British didn't just build on top of Calcutta, they changed the ground. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what was there. By 1750, Calcutta was already one of the most commercially sophisticated cities in Asia. The area around Sutanuti, one of the 3 villages the company had consolidated into Calcutta, had operated as a trading settlement for generations before Job Charnock arrived and claimed to have founded it in 1690. The founding myth was British, the city was not. The original settlement sat at a precise elevation relative to the Hooghly River. This was not accidental. The Bengali merchants, weavers, and traders who had built around Sutanuti understood tidal hydrology in ways that took the British engineers 2 generations to partially grasp and another 2 to systematically destroy. The buildings were positioned to manage seasonal flooding. The lanes channeled water. The ghats, the stepped riverbank platforms, were the economic arteries of the entire settlement, where goods moved from boat to market to warehouse in a sequence that had been optimized over centuries. The British looked at this system and called it chaos. That word matters, chaos. It appears in East India Company administrative documents from the 1790s onward with a striking regularity. The existing lanes were chaotic. The drainage was anarchic. The settlement patterns of the indigenous population were irregular. Every one of these words was doing political work. Calling a system chaotic is the administrative precondition for replacing it. Here is what the company records say happened next, if you know how to read them. Between 1800 and 1930, the colonial administration undertook a series of what they called improvement schemes for Calcutta. The language was always the same: modernization, sanitation, order. The schemes were overseen by the Lottery Committee, established in 1717, which funded public works through, and this detail is always omitted from the official history, a lottery system that extracted money primarily from the Indian population of the city to pay for infrastructure that displaced it. The committee raised the streets, not all at once, block by block, year by year, in a process that mirrors what happened in Seattle after the 1889 fire, with one critical difference. Seattle burned first. Calcutta didn't need to burn. The British had the institutional authority to simply decide the ground was wrong and change it. The raising was between 15 and 30 feet in different parts of the city, depending on what the surveyors determined was necessary for what they called proper drainage. Proper drainage meant water flowing away from the European quarter. The fill came from the excavation of the tank square, from river dredging, from the systematic leveling of indigenous earthworks that the colonial engineers categorized as waste ground. What went under the fill was not waste ground. The economic history of what was buried has only been partially reconstructed, and most of that reconstruction happened in Bengali-language scholarship that never crossed into the English language historiography. With those scholars documented is this. The original Sutanuti market district sat at the old ground level. It was one of the most active cloth trading centers in Bengal, connected through a network of brokers, weavers, and financiers that the British themselves relied on entirely for the first century of company operations. The Seths and Basaks, the merchant families who made Calcutta commercially viable before the British consolidated control, operated from this district. Their warehouses, their counting houses, their residential compounds were built to the old elevation. When the streets were raised, those buildings did not disappear. They became basements, then sub-basements. Their ground floors dropped below the new street level, the same way the first floors of old Seattle dropped below the post-fire regrades. Unlike Seattle, no one ran tours. Unlike Seattle, the people whose commercial world was literally buried beneath colonial infrastructure did not have a Bill Spidel 60 years later to take journalists underground and say, "Look at what is still down there." The Lottery Committee's own published reports described the removal of what they called native structures obstructing improvement. They do not describe what those structures were, who built them, or what economic activity they supported. The erasure was administrative before it was physical. There's a document in the West Bengal State Archives in Calcutta that I have not been able to access directly, but is referenced in 3 separate Bengali historical monographs from the 1960s and 1970s. It is a petition dated 1824 from a coalition of cloth merchants in the Burrabazar district addressed to the Governor General. The merchants are writing to protest the raising of a street that will, in their words, bury the access to our premises and destroy the trade of 30 families who have operated here before the company held its first charter. The petition was denied. The street was razed. The families are not mentioned again in the colonial record. If there's one petition in the West Bengal State Archives, there are 50 more, because that is what merchants do when the ground is being changed beneath their businesses. They write it down. They appeal to the authority that is doing it, and the authority files the appeal and raises the street anyway, and the document sits in the archive for 200 years, waiting for someone to look in the right folder. I keep returning to one question: how much is still there? The water table in Calcutta is high. The soil is alluvial, river delta silt, compressible, poor at preserving organic material. Timber rots, brick survives, and there is a great deal of very old brick in the foundations of central Calcutta that the engineers who renovate buildings regularly encounter and regularly photograph and rarely investigate. In 2007, construction workers excavating for a new building foundation in the Burrabazar district hit a layer of what the contractor's report described as old masonry of unknown origin at approximately 9 meters below current street level. The recommendation was to fill and continue. The recommendation was followed. 9 meters is approximately 30 feet. The original city is still down there, not as a continuous preserved district, the water table and the soil have taken their toll, but as evidence, as the physical record of a commercial world that was functioning, sophisticated, and economically self-sufficient before the British decided it needed to be improved into the ground. The streets of colonial Calcutta were raised in the name of sanitation. They were also raised in the name of control. When you change the ground level of a city, you decide whose architecture is above it and whose is below. You decide whose commerce connects to the street and whose has to be approached through a basement, then an excavation, then a historical monograph that will be published in a language the people who made the decision never learned. Britain raised the streets 30 feet, and they called it improvement. The original city didn't disappear. It just stopped being visible to the people who were standing on top of it. The West Bengal State Archives are open to researchers. The colonial-era Lottery Committee records have been partially digitized. The Bengali scholarship exists.